it's interesting when we talk about Western perspective and Russian perspective, we often tend to think of them as diametrically opposed. And it's true that Russia accuses the West and the West accuses Russia, for example, for the causes of the current confrontation. But I think there are also important points of similarity between the two. And the one that you already referred to a degree, that from the Western point of view, you could often hear that the conflict in Ukraine is an existential struggle, is the struggle for the future of the world order. And it presented a liberal world order versus, non-liberal world order. Obviously, Russia wouldn't accept this kind of labels provided by the West. But I think in Russia there is very similar perspective that what we are seeing right now is an existential struggle, and it will transform international system and transform the world order.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and I am here today with Dr. Igor Istomin, who's an associate professor at the Department of Applied International Political Analysis at the MGIMO University in Moscow. He's also a former senior fellow at the Harvard Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. Dr. Istomin is the author of more than 70 academic publications on Russian and U.S. foreign policy, Euro-Atlantic matters, and international security. He's also a regular contributor to media and think tank debates. Dr. Istomin, thank you very much for talking to me today.
Hello, and thank you so much for having me.
Well, this is a very difficult time, and I really wanted to talk to you because I wanted to get an insight from a political analyst and fellow political science researcher on what the situation in and for Russia looks like at the moment. Could you maybe first of all give us an impression of what the general atmosphere is like in Moscow? Are the sanctions impacting you? Did life change in the past half a year for Russians? And how does the Russian government portray the current situation?
Well, you see, obviously, when the situation started to develop in February 2022, there was the impression that what we are witnessing is a tectonic change in international politics and the tectonic change for Russia, for example. I think it is a bit difficult also for us as kind of foreign policy analysts to speak on this topic because we are living in a kind of the bubble. And obviously there is a lot of interest and a lot of following of the international news of what is happening in Ukraine right now across all the sectors of the Russian society. But if you look at how the ordinary life of the people changed, I think you will be struck by the kind of the normalcy of what is happening and how little, in a way, the change of the ordinary Russians and the routines changed. I'm not sure I'm eligible to speak for the whole of the country because Russia is very diverse and different and has different regions with different ways of life. But at least in the major cities, in places like Moscow, you see that there are many things which happened previously. They continue to happen, and there is a sense of normalcy, which is also to a degree kind of expressed by the political leadership in a way. So if we talk about sanctions, obviously they have an impact on, for example, what the Russians are consuming at the moment, what kind of goods and services they receive, where they can go to the vacation, for example, because the EU countries were a big tourist destination, and last summer, the tourists went in different other places. But at the same time, there is a lot of continuity. And I think another factor which we have to take into account is the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic, which kind of made the life even of the middle class, for example, in Russia, much less international and much more focused on, traveling across the country, consuming some of the local products, using the local services. So kind of because these new developments, because the special military operation started right after this pandemic, there is also some kind of continuity from that period.
I see. And do you hear from the Russian government at the moment, or did you hear one single narrative since the beginning of the operation in Ukraine, or did what you heard from government change over time, like let's say about objectives or of reasons for what's going on?
Well, I think it is hard to see any significant differences from the initial goals that were announced on February 24th. Now, there are different political figures who try to speak on behalf of the government and could have somewhat different interpretations and provide somewhat different perspectives. But I think the overall narrative remains the same, and it kind of resonates around the two kind of major aspects. One is the representation of the current situation as a result, basically, of the last 30 years, when the Russian grievances towards the West primarily were not heard and not addressed. And as a result, it is the current situation in Ukraine is presented as part of the kind of much more general struggle over the European order and over the security for Russia. And then there is the second element, and I don't mean that the first and the second one are more important, just this is how the way I kind of mentioned them, but the second element is a more kind of humanitarian element, which kind of trying to say that the military hostilities didn't start in February 2022, that there was a long track record of suffering for the people of Donbass in particular, and that basically all other options related to the Minsk agreement were exhausted by Russia. And at the current stage, the only way how to secure the life and liberty of these people is through pursuing the course that is pursuing right now. So I think these are the two main narratives that are kind of presented by the political leadership, by the government, and again, different speakers, they at different points in time, depending on the audience, they emphasize either the first more kind of grandeur and strategic and global narrative, or more kind of what could be said humanitarian and kind of based on this feeling of compatriotism with those people who live in Donbass.
And in the West, these reasons that Russia is giving are being portrayed as either lies, or they're being portrayed as just cheap excuses. On the first point, it's usually mentioned that NATO is purely defensive and nobody ever pushed Russia into invading Ukraine. It was Russia who's the aggressor. And on the second one, it's usually said that for the last 7 years, Russia has been operating military personnel in the Donbass, and it was a war of Russia's making already 7 years ago, and Russia never implemented the Minsk agreements, and this is all Russia's fault. Now, of course, the Russian government will have a completely entirely different spin on that. Now, my question is, the population in Russia, or as you see them, are they firmly behind the Russian version of what's going on, or are there very important dissident voices that would rather follow the Western narrative?
Well, I think we would need to conduct some kind of sociological research to answer the question how and what is the proportion of within the population. I'm not a sociologist myself, so I'm having somewhat trouble to kind of discerning the specifics. But I think the overall argument is quite broadly shared within the Russian population, and there are obviously different views within the society over the events, but there are also some critical views, for example, which may be not so viewed or not perceived in the West. There is, for example, criticisms of the government why it waited for so long to take a more decisive action. That the current activities or the current strategy should have been pursued much earlier, and then it would be it would avoid many of the sufferings which are associated with the last 8 years. So I think there are different views within the Russian population, obviously, but it seems that at this point in time, the overall political consensus is here. The numbers of the public polls which were conducted, for example, on the approval of the president or approval of the government, it demonstrated a rise in the month after the February 24th. And so I think that, I mean, it is a popular view, not only about what happens in Russia, but I think I could hear in many other situations when, for example, the Western commentators or the Western leaders would try to kind of present as society and government as kind of staying against each other in some countries, be it Russia, be it China, be it Iran, for example. And I think this is a very simplistic view of the situation, and I don't think that it really reflects the reality.
You know, in Western media, it's often like now Russia is being portrayed as a revisionist, autocratic regime that wants to undermine the so-called liberal international order and does this out of malign intent, wants to overthrow international law and dominate Europe or even the whole world. Ukraine, on the other hand, is portrayed as a state standing up and fighting for democracy and for liberal values. And I have this very strong impression that this is a ideological narrative that falls apart very quickly. But you know, at the end of the day, what we have, and you already alluded to it, is we do have a great power conflict, right? Between Russia on the one hand and the US on the other. Europe is somewhere in between, and Ukraine is currently the proxy war where this is being fought out in a hot war. And when I listen to people like Dmitry Trenin and other Russian thinkers, and also when I listen to your foreign office, like how Mr. Lavrov is portraying the situation, I keep getting the impression that Russians view this situation through the lens of classic realism. Nation against nations, or country against country, state against state, and a great power conflict. Is that a fair assessment? Do you share that view? Are Russians realists, or is there some ideological component still going on in Russia right now?
I think it's very interesting how you pose it, and you kind of presented these two poles of idealism and ideological view and realism. I would add some third element, which I think is very important and used to be very important for the Russian foreign policy for quite some time. It's institutionalism. I'm not sure that the Russian foreign policy, the way it developed since 1991, was a strictly realist enterprise. If you look at the foreign policy identity, at the documents, at the statements, and to a degree on the activities of what Russia was doing, foreign policy for the last 30 years was very much about institutions, about building institutions, and about promoting foreign policy goals through institutions. The Russian leadership always spoke about the United Nations as the kind of center of the international order. The Russian foreign policy documents were kind of emphasizing the international law, and what I see from kind of a university perspective, there is a lot of training. When in training diplomats, the legal component is always very important in Russia. And if you look at the post-Soviet space, you see that this kind of attempts to build all kinds of institutions, sometimes mimicking the Western institutions like Eurasian Economic Union, like the Collective Security Treaty Organization, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And even despite the fact that, for example, we know from the realist school that for the stronger powers, it is often better to engage in bilateral relations, and to kind of, because in bilateral interaction, it has the most leverage. Ironically, Russia was trying to build all kinds of institutions, which you could say would tame to a degree influence. And it also operated within institutional framework when dealing in Europe. For example, it was in the 90s, it was great support of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And it pushed, for example, to adopt the charter of this organization, to transform it into the legal organization rather than political association, which is right now. So there was this institutional component, and I think the kind of the problem for the Russian foreign policy to a degree right now is that in certain circumstances, institutionalism backfired against itself, right? So it attempts to build up OSCE didn't work as it intended, and in some cases, OSCE started to be a very critical organization of Russia, and for example, Russian internal politics. It tried to comment and criticize on that. And we see it in certain other respects as well. So I think from this perspective, the kind of what we are having right now is a certain rethinking in Russia itself. Some of the approaches and kind of perspectives that it was having before that. But what I wanted to emphasize is the tradition of institutionalism is very strong in Russia, and it interacts in a quite complex ways with the realist perspective, because I also agree with you that there is an idea of great powerness is very important for the Russian foreign policy. And again, it's not something new. Somebody here talking that, about the return of great power politics. If you look at the statements of President Yeltsin back in the early 90s or in the mid 90s, this idea of Russia as a great power was very, very important part of his worldview as a politician. So in this case, I would say there is also continuity, but there was this idea that on the one hand we have a great powers, on the other hand they could act and they could create some kind of concert of cooperative relations, working through the institutions, through some institutional frameworks. I think that would be the correct representation. As for the ideology, I do think that in the 90s there was a strong backlash in Russia against ideology. It was perceived that the Soviet Union was too much of an ideological state, and that was a bad thing. And the core word for the Russia, both in foreign and domestic affairs, was, I think, pragmatism. Russian leadership was seeking this to be pragmatic and get rid of the ideology. But I think, and that's kind of my perspective, it's impossible to build, non-ideological society in general. You have different degree of ideologization in policies, but you need some sense where are you going and what are the core values, and the values thing is something which is given to you by some ideology. And I think eventually we could say, obviously, about certain values which are emphasized by Russia as a state. And I think the primary value which is kind of emphasized again in the Russian foreign policy identity, as well as in Russian domestic political identity, would be the value of stability and order. In this perspective, the Western activities were often perceived as counterproductive because they were undermining the stability by, for example, trying to spread certain political agenda, the democratization perspective. That was perceived as a threat to the order and stability.
Thank you for that. That's an interesting point, especially about institutionalization or institutionalism. Do you think Russia will now try to build more institutions with non-Western countries, with China, in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, with Iran? Is that going to be one of the next decades or so goals? I mean, right now it seems to me that Russia is working on creating alternative payment systems. The US dollar will probably lose in dominance and create alternatives need to be created first. Is that something that's firmly on the agenda, or how do you see that?
I think it is on the agenda starting from the late 2000s at least. And the one also grouping that I didn't mention, but I think which is a great reflection of that, is BRICS. And now there is a lot of also talks about BRICS Plus, for example, so that creating this kind of opportunities for other countries to engage with BRICS beyond these groupings, and maybe to enlarge it. So, but obviously, Shanghai Cooperation Organization is another great example. And I do think that this shift was already happening for quite some time, from the attempts to build some cooperative institutions with the West, or to try to integrate. I think even if you go earlier, there was even an attempt to integrate into the Western institution. And with the failure of that, indeed, there will be, I think, more and more pressure on the Russian side to create some institutional frameworks for cooperating with non-Western states.
This leads me to my next question, which also connects to this point that currently in the West, one of the things that worries me very much is that, like, almost any newspaper you open today, you usually read this framing that Russia is isolated from the world. The world has outcast Russia. The world comes together, and the world has said this is enough. And all of these papers fail to see that the world refers to Western Europe and the United States, but that South America is not on board, that Africa is not on board, and Southeast Asia certainly not on board. So there's and India is not on board of all of this, right? So the BRICS nations are huge. So are these other nations outside of Europe being perceived by Russia as friendly? Are they being perceived as neutral? You know, this channel is about neutrality studies, and it seems to me that neutrality currently is kind of moving out of Europe. Sweden and Finland gave it up, and Switzerland was not able to function anymore as a protecting power for Ukraine because Russia last month rejected that, saying, Switzerland, you picked your side, you are with the sanctioneers, so we are not accepting you as neutral anymore. Austria and Ireland are anyhow like inside the EU, so I don't think Russia would perceive them as very neutral. But does Russia perceive non-European states outside of this theater as still as neutral in the conflict?
That's an interesting question, and maybe if I also would add something on your representation, because I think it's interesting when we talk about Western perspective and Russian perspective, we often tend to think of them as diametrically opposing. And it's true that Russia accuses the West and the West accuses Russia, for example, for the causes of the current confrontation. But I think there are also important points of similarity between the two. And the one that you already referred to a degree, that from the Western point of view, you could often hear that the conflict in Ukraine is an existential struggle, is the struggle for the future of the world order. And it presented a liberal world order versus, non-liberal world order. Obviously, Russia wouldn't accept this kind of labels provided by the West. But I think in Russia there is very similar perspective that what we are seeing right now is an existential struggle, and it will transform international system and transform the world order from the attempts to create some kind of unipolar, non-democratic order centered around the United States to a more multipolar and, as a result, more democratic order as the Russia would present it. And kind of the future of this trend is to a significant degree dependent on how the conflict in Ukraine will develop, right? But despite this kind of differences in the presentation of the order, both sides agree about the crucial importance of what's happening now in Eastern Europe for the future of the world.
Right.
And I'm really not sure that the countries outside of the Euro-Atlantic really share the same sense of urgency and importance of this conflict. I think many countries in Asia Pacific, for example, they view as a kind of some distant distant conflict between some, you could say, Western states, and for them, Russia would also be a Western state to many of them. It is kind of a family quarrel, so to say, within this kind of part of the world, and they wouldn't accept it as the kind of game shifting, paradigm shifting event. For them, it is much more important what's happening in and around Taiwan, for example, or in South China, or basically in their area of the world. And they would say, this is where the center of economic gravity of the world has moved. So this is the most important part, and this is where the history is made. So I think there is this difference in perspective of both sides, Russia and the West, from some other regions in some other countries, and I think it's kind of interesting divergence.
It is interesting, and you're absolutely right. I mean, over here in Japan and talking to friends from Southeast Asia and also from India, they go like, yeah, this is a European problem. Let's be honest, this is a very typical European problem. I mean, this is not the first Crimean War we've ever had, right? I mean, you don't even need to go back 200 years to find like similar fault lines, right? Let me maybe.
To your point, if I can jump in, I didn't answer your question. I'm sorry for that. I realized it.
Go ahead.
Would you like me to do that? I'm not sure that the notion of neutrality is necessarily attributed to the Asian states or to the Latin American states in Russia. Something which was transferred, I think, from the Russian discourse about Europe to the Russian discourse about other regions is the idea of inclusivity. Maybe some of your listeners and viewers remember that for quite some time, Russia was presenting this principle as the OSCE principle, the principle of indivisibility of security in Europe. And it was trying to push it in the European region. And it was trying to present, for example, in 2008, 2009, 2010, the idea of the new European Security Treaty, which would be based at that point in time. There was President Medvedev, he was talking about indivisibility of European security guaranteed by this proposed treaty. Now, in the 2010s already, Russia was transferring this idea of the indivisibility also to the Asian context, and it was trying to sell to ASEAN, to other Asian actors, the idea that we should introduce the principle of indivisibility of security. And what does it mean is that the security of one state cannot be improved on its own. It can be improved in a way that will hurt the security of someone else, right?
The good old security dilemma.
It's an attempt. Once again, we are talking. Russia is perceived as a realist state, but the realists they believe that security dilemma is inevitable, right? It's something that you have to live with. And now Russia was trying to escape the security dilemma for quite some time. And in this regard, it's kind of trying to look for the inclusive security order, not only in Europe, but also in Asia. As a result of that, for example, this explains a very vocal and very negative reaction of Russia to, for example, the notion of Indo-Pacific. If you heard the Russian diplomats, when it was initially announced, it was from the start, criticized by Minister Lavrov and then by other diplomats, because it is presented, this notion, along with the associations created by the United States, like Quad, like AUKUS, as instruments to polarize the region.
Yes.
To get rid of the ASEAN centrality, to create non-inclusive institutions, but exclusive institutions, to bring only few good guys, in the institution. And Russia is against that. Russia is against that, also for the very pragmatic reasons. Maybe for it is institutionalist by the realist reasons, what I would say. For example, one of the reasons is this polarization in Asia, for example, will make much more difficult for Russia to pursue its traditional course of having a broad network of positive relations with countries which are not necessarily on the same side. For example, with China, with India, with Vietnam. They have quite complex relations. And there is a concern, a threat that, tends to create certain camps in Asia, will bring different countries in different camps.
But that's interesting because, in the West, what I often hear is this idea or this fear that Russia is trying to build an anti-NATO with its approach towards the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or so on, and that Russia wants to go back to the Cold War. I mean, Vladimir Putin is often portrayed as nostalgic about the Cold War and wanting, again, a bipolarity, where the fronts are very clear. But what you are saying is that that hasn't been the Russian strategy forever. The Russian strategy is to build institutions, inclusive ones.
Sorry for interrupting, but yeah, I think it is a very popular idea, and it's based on a very selective reading of history and very kind of non-attention to what Russia was saying. Not only Russia was saying, basically, I don't think that in this regard, the Russian foreign policy is so much different from the Soviet foreign policy. Because if you remember, the Soviet Union back in the 1940s was against the division of Germany.
Right.
It was for kind of the neutralization of Germany. In the 1970s, it was the Soviet Union who was pressing, and in the 1960s, for the conference on security and cooperation in Europe, right?
Yes.
It was the Soviet idea, and Soviet Union wanted some all-European institution.
Yes.
Recently, Mikhail Gorbachev passed away. You remember that his idea was the idea of Europe as a common European whole, right? And again, I already said it in the 90s, Russia was the main driving force for transformation of the CSC into OSC. Okay? It was trying to create an inclusive framework where Russia will be an important voice. And when Russia will have a seat at the table. Now, why we are talking so much about, for example, NATO enlargement? Because NATO enlargement was premised on a different logic, that not all European institutions will be the center for the order, but NATO will be the center for the European order. And we can discuss why it was the case and why the United States liked NATO, for example, and why the Western Europeans like NATO. Maybe because they believe that it is more practical organization than something more amorphous like OSCE. Maybe they liked it because it could help them to solve the situation in the Balkans. Maybe it helped them because it secured American presence in Europe, and it also because of the fears that were even in the 80s and in the 90s about the German revisionism. We remember that when Germany was reunited, France and Britain were very, very concerned. So I do not say why the United States and their allies wanted NATO to be the center player in Europe. What I am trying to say that by doing so, they automatically marginalized Russia, and they automatically preserve the bipolarity in Europe, right?
Yes.
Because there was no place for Russia in this architecture, and Russia felt that it is not provided a fair seat at the table. Now, Russia tried to cooperate even in this circumstance. It tried to, switch the tables. So what you saw in the early 2000s was an attempt to create a NATO-centered institutional framework in Europe where Russia would have an important place. And that was the Russian NATO Council, which was created in 2002. Russia thought that this will be like a security council in Europe, right? It will be the place where it will have a seat, and the Western powers will have a seat, and they will deliberate on the most important issues, and they will kind of come with some solutions, and there will be no decisions without Russia involved, so to say. Now, the later history demonstrated that it wasn't the case, that Russian NATO Council didn't act as this institution. We could also speak for the wider reasons and what were the flaws in the kind of Russian plans to do so. But at the end of the day, it didn't work out. And when it didn't work out, Russia was trying to search for some alternatives. And again, if you talk about Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we also need to think about the roots of institutions. Shanghai Cooperation Organization dates back to the 90s when there was these negotiations on the border problems between China and the former Soviet republics. And they tried to kind of avoid securitization of their relation. They tried to desecuritize these relations, and it worked out. It worked out. At some point in the 2000s, when the Russian attempts to create some more cooperative relations with the West failed, I think it is fair to say that there were an attempt to kind of present Shanghai Cooperation as kind of alternative, and to kind of, maybe it's even the way to bargain, right? A bargaining trick, so to say, okay, if you don't like us in your regional order, we have alternatives. But Russia tried hard to find some framework, and I mentioned already quite several iterations dating back to the 50s and going to the more closer time, like Treaty on European Security architecture of the late 2000s. So it was making attempt after attempt after attempt to find its place in Europe with the West. But it also wasn't ready to accept the Western dominance, to accept, the fully endorse the Western standards and the Western requirements. At some point in time, it came close to that. It was perhaps in the early 90s. But the result of that endorsement was not very positive for the Russian population. In the Russian, again, we could say to what extent it is fair or unfair, but in the Russian popular memories, the 90s was a dark age.
It was horrible economically.
Yeah.
It was a catastrophe.
And in the Western perspective, the 90s was the glorious time, right?
That's beautiful.
And so this creates a real problem, structural problem. And as I said, that's why, from my perspective, what we had in Europe even after the end of the Cold War, was effectively a bipolar system, a bipolarity, which was not very obvious for some time, but now it's becoming more and more obvious. And as you said, if you have such a bipolar situation, there is not much space for the neutrality or for some middle ground, for some position in between. And perhaps you're right that today the situation is different from the 20th century. Today there is less place for neutrality or non-alignment than it was in the Cold War. Everybody has to take sides.
Yeah, although I still do think that in the developing world there's a lot of a lot of countries are trying to not do that, not pick a side, but that at the moment is already interpreted as picking a side, you know. But that's also a classical dynamic. Maybe to just finish the discussion here, what's yes, you want to say something?
Only about Europe, right? I completely agree with you what you said that in Asia. I remember this. The Prime Minister of Singapore a couple of years ago said exactly what you just said. He was saying that maybe at some point in the future we will have to take sides, but he was intending not between Russia and the West, but between China and the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't want this time to come too soon, right? That was his saying. I have kind of a concern that we are moving more and more into the division of the two camps globally, but globally we are not yet there. In Europe, it is very black and white at this moment.
I would hope that we get out of that. Seriously, this confrontation, we can only lose on it. And maybe I want to finish with that. I mean, do you have any kind of optimism? Because it is really hard these days to come by optimistic assessments. Or is there any hope that in the end, we Europeans, the Russians and the Germans and the Swiss and the Spanish and the Brits, somehow understand that we populate the same continent and that we somehow need to get along with each other? Do you see any chances for reconciliation? And if you don't, you don't, because it's really hard to see at the moment. I just thought I ask.
Yeah, I really think it's difficult to find this point in time. You know, I was thinking for quite some time that throughout 2000s, I was not thinking that, but I was at least hoping that the growing competition between the United States and China would create some space when these two greatest economies would kind of struggle with each other. It will create an opportunity for Europe, and Russia is part of Europe, to kind of create something like a non-alignment movement and say, okay, you struggle between each other, and we will kind of try to stay out of that, and we will be on our own. We will trade, for example, this traditional idea, Russian resources for the Western technologies or for the European technologies, and we'll stay out. But the trends are going into the completely different direction. I think what we see right now is that the Europeans are they got much more dependent on the US in the last half a year.
Yes.
And I think it is very problematic at this point in time to talk about something like strategic autonomy of Europe. And the result of this current struggle with the West is obviously another result is the consolidation of the Russian-Chinese alliance, Russian-Chinese ties. So I think we are witnessing a much more kind of divided situation right now.
Do you see that happening, a Russian-Chinese? I wouldn't think that there will ever be a formal alliance, but Russian-Chinese close security cooperation?
Well, I think the institutional framework is not that important as the political content for me. I'm maybe a bit more realist than the general Russian foreign policy thinking. That's why I would kind of look at it as a constitutionalist. So, I mean, how it will be called and what will be the kind of specific formulas, I think we should have to see. But the Russian-Chinese cooperation is certainly growing, and as our Chinese friends said, these are cooperation without upper limit. And yeah, that's I think a very fair representation of the current trends.
Okay, thank you very much for all your assessments. I mean, we are in the middle of a storm, and it's really hard to see the blue sky anywhere in the right now. But I do hope it will come back, and I thank you for sharing your thoughts and your assessments. I really appreciate it, and I hope we can stay in touch and discuss again in the near future.